All right, everybody. Welcome. I'm Shiloh Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of the James Madison Program here at Princeton, and I'm happy to welcome you to the lecture this afternoon, the title of which is Saving Democracy, Looking to Lincoln. If you aren't familiar with the Madison Program, we explore American constitutional law, Western political thought. You can learn more about us on our website, social media, Twitter, podcasts, newsletter, whatever your chosen fare is, we serve. So without further ado, I'm really happy to welcome the Madison Program's own, by the way, Allen Guelzo, to speak to us this afternoon. He is the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar and the director of our initiative on politics and statesmanship. He also happens to be a 3-time winner of the Lincoln Prize for his books on Abraham Lincoln and the New York Times bestselling author of Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. His most recent book, and the topic of our lecture tonight, is Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. Copies of that book are on sale right outside the door, and I suspect you could get him to sign your copy should you wish to purchase one, which you should do. So, without further ado, everybody, please join me in welcoming Princeton's own Allen Guelzo.
Thank you, Shiloh, and what a pleasure it is to look around the room and see so many friends, new and old. I see friends from the Madison Program. I see friends who have been and are currently students. I see Thomas over there. I see Juliana right here with her dog, and you were just in class yesterday. I look around, I see so many others. I see John Gore, and probably in the category of newest, since we only met for the first time last night. And I see other students who I have had over the years. I see Jaden, I see Will, I see so many wonderful people. So, and another fellow teacher in the form of John Matsui. So nice to have coming over from the Hunton School. So what a very pleasant opportunity this is to see so many wonderful people that I've come to know and to treasure over the years. Let me talk a little about Lincoln this afternoon. 150 years after his death, no American president was to be able to match the reverence and the attention paid to Abraham Lincoln. And that raises the very... Why? One particular reason for that interest is, I think, the atmosphere of crisis and anxiety that we experience about the American democratic experiment itself. Now, true, American politics, as always, presented us with waves of political frenzy, sometimes hyperbole, frequently apprehension. But in recent times, that apprehension has reached levels not seen in our national life in more than a century. Whether it takes the form of rioters in the streets and even in the national capital, or partisan rage in legislatures, in journalism, and even in the courts, the impatient cacophony that rises all around us is drowning our sense of hope and direction for democracy. And we do not always find examples or solutions on the American landscape very easily. So we cast our eyes to the past, and we wonder if we can find direction and hope there, past. And we wonder again if those directions and hopes and restore direction and hope now. Another part of that apprehension grows from what we have seen happen to democracy decades. In 1989, a democratic miracle placed before our eyes with the fall of the most obvious symbol of totalitarian despotism, the Berlin Wall. And 2 years later, we beheld an even greater miracle with the collapse of the single greatest model of totalitarian dictatorship, Soviet Union. And at that moment, we were giddy enough to believe that democracy was the only political player left standing in the world, that it had vanquished all of its authoritarian foes, now offered the one safe path to peace, human flourishing. But that was followed all too quickly by a murderous campaign of international religious terror, of economic collapse, political panic, and then the reestablishment of an authoritarian regime in Russia, and the empowerment of a totalitarian despotism in China. Freedom House's report for 2024, Freedom in the World, announced back in April that a fifth of the world's population had seen democracy erode. Only 20 countries can now speak of themselves as free. So we wonder, is democracy so weak? Is it really nothing more than a temporary protest against power, which can be quickly and easily silenced? Which is why we turn to Abraham Lincoln. Certainly Lincoln faced a similar time of crisis and anxiety when Americans were unsure about their experiment in democracy and whether it might in fact self-destruct over the issue of legalized slavery. We do not often appreciate the levels of that uncertainty because we know a little too easily that we survived them. And so we assume that survival was pleasantly inevitable. But any casual read through the newspapers and the letters of the 1850s tells a different story of the refusal to listen, of the resort to casual outbreaks of violence, and finally a determination to break up the United States completely. Along with those fears for the destruction of the American democracy, Lincoln also faced a loss of confidence in the very idea of democracy itself. Well, what else was the attempt of the breakaway Southern Confederacy to withdraw from the Union and set up its own independent government, but a rejection of the constitutional process of decision-making in the American democracy? Confederate secession was triggered by a rejection of a fundamental component of that democracy, which is elections. Even worse, it was done for the protection of a system of labor, chattel slavery, which was itself a negation of democracy and the fundamental natural rights recognized in the American Declaration of Independence. For Lincoln, the Confederacy, he said, presents the question whether discontented individuals can always, upon the pretenses made in this case, or any other pretenses, or arbitrarily without any pretense, break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government. Lincoln faced this disintegration of confidence in democracy, not only at home, but abroad as well. Since the European nations, governed as they were by hereditary kings and emperors, rejoiced at the prospect of the only large-scale democratic experiment in the world energetically destroying itself. Creation of the Confederacy would, Lincoln feared, leads some foreign nations to shape their action as if they supposed the early destruction of our national union was probable. The United States would then either descend into anarchy and emerge from anarchy, pleading for a king or a strong man to save it, or else it would continue to divide and subdivide until it's subdivided into so many splinters as to render it absurd. If we now recognize this doctrine, by allowing the seceders to go in peace, it is difficult to see what we can do if others choose to go, or to extort terms upon which they were promised to remain. In such a case, what would the United States have become if the Confederacy had succeeded, except the American equivalent of the Balkans, and just as irrelevant to world history? And yet, facing these terrible prospects, Lincoln succeeded, not just in preserving the democratic ship of state in one piece, but in keeping the whole experiment remarkably true to its democratic course. If, against such towering odds, and in the face of such daunting prospects, Lincoln found the means to this success, then no wonder that in our own perplexed times we turn to Lincoln more than any other figure from our past for aid, counsel. Lincoln only ever gave one definition of democracy in 1858. And significantly, it was in connection with his opposition to slavery. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. In effect, this states a kind of political golden rule. If you do not want to be controlled and oppressed by someone else, do not be a controller or oppressor yourself. Understand, in other words, that the essence of democracy lies in consent. You do not wish to be controlled by another without agreeing to that control? Then don't attempt it. Don't attempt to foist control on others without their permission. And what other thing is slavery at its root but the denial to other human beings of the power to consent to what is done to them? Slaves are slaves precisely because no one thinks to ask their consent. This is what makes slavery so near kin to monarchy, and so massively a contradiction of democracy. The governments instituted among men, said Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It was the unwillingness of the King of Great Britain to obtain that consent which drove the American revolutionaries to their act of separation. No matter in what shape it comes, Lincoln said, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same principle. Democracies behave differently. Before a democratic government acts, it must have the consent of its people to so act. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent, Lincoln declared in 1854. I say, this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Deriving the just powers of governments from the consent of the government almost stood for Lincoln on the same emotional and authoritative ground as religion which is why he would describe this idea of consent as our ancient faith. Lincoln develops the notion of consent in four ways, beginning with the fundamental location of sovereignty, which is another way of describing where real authority in political life lies, and what the justification should be for doing one thing as a nation rather than another. In a democracy, sovereignty resides in the people. This country, he said, with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it. At the time of his first inauguration as the 16th president, he articulated that principle, and he reiterated it at Gettysburg in the fall of 1863, when he spoke of the American experiment as government of the people, by the people, for the people. We can also say that in a democracy, sovereignty also moves in a certain way. In a democracy, sovereignty rises from the people upwards, and not as in a monarchy where sovereignty is bestowed by God on a king and works its way downwards. Democracy knows nothing about hierarchy, where societies sort themselves out according to class or status. Instead of deferring to dukes and princes and counts and earls and what have you, in a democracy, equal citizens decide among themselves the best way to be governed and to govern themselves. And then they tell their government to do. The American democracy, as it functioned in Lincoln's day, was, admittedly, something less than perfect in its practice. Only adult males could vote in elections on a national basis. But in the long travail of human history, practice has always been struggling to catch up with principle. So this is not necessarily some fatal bruise. The remarkable achievement of the American democracy was that it had a democratic principle to aspire to from the very start, and has kept up its exploration of that principle ever since. Second basic characteristic that Lincoln saw in a democracy was a matter of elections. Pure democracy, like that of ancient Athens, where every citizen participated in the city assembly, can only function on a small scale, face-to-face basis. And the Athenian democracy was indeed small, probably involved no more than 6,000 people in the city assembly. In a large-scale democracy like the United States, large in both territorial size and delay in communication, and in sheer population numbers, into that democracy Americans incorporated republican principles, which is to say that the people elect representatives and officers who govern in their name. This is not because those representatives and officers enjoy some mysterious right to rule by virtue of their class or status or education, but simply and exclusively because the people find it convenient and efficient to designate a few to do the job of ruling on behalf of the many, because the many are busy at other jobs. Purpose of elections is to remind those representatives and officers of their ultimate accountability too. For that reason, elections must be free and fair, and above all, frequent. We cannot have free government without elections, Lincoln said in 1864. Whatever could force us to forego or postpone a national election might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. And if there is a problem with the results of elections, and how can there not be a problem, because somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, then the solution to such a problem in a democracy is not revolution or secession or civil war. It is the next election. There can be no successful appeal, he said, except to ballots themselves at succeeding elections. Those elections will establish the identity of a majority in a democracy. And that identification is necessary because no democratic society, even on the small scale of Athens, is ever going to be unanimous in its decision-making. Unanimity is impossible, Lincoln said in 1861. But the rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left. For that reason, the privilege of establishing policy belongs to those whom an election identifies as a majority. Democratic elections, however, do not equip a majority with absolute power. Precisely because sovereignty belongs to all the people in democracy, democracies restrict what majorities may do to the minorities that they have outpolled. They may not oppress or harass the minority, nor may they eliminate the minority by violence or by other means. And they're forbidden to do this in democratic practice because majorities are not always right, even as majorities. Nor are minorities wrong. There is in democracy at its core certain humility. It recognizes that any majority can make a mistake and that minorities must be allowed their say because they may turn out in the long run to be right and persuade enough of the people to become the new majority. Minorities, likewise, do not need to be impatient, desperate, particularly if the principle of frequent elections returns the power of decision-making to their hands at regular intervals. Why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people, Lincoln asked. Truth and that justice will surely prevail by the judgment of this great tribunal, the American people. So the guiding principle about majorities in a democracy is that majorities may rule, but they do not suppress the minority. And minorities may dissent. They may not subvert the majority. Finally, the safest guarantee for the longevity of a democracy is law, and the reverence that democratic citizens show for law. In his earliest major public speech in January of 1838, Lincoln urgently promoted the strictest and the most unyielding version of law and order. As the patriots of '76 did to the support of the Declaration of Independence, so to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor, Lincoln said. Let every man remember that to violate the law, to trample on the blood of his father, to tear the charter of his own and his children's liberty. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. And in short, let it become political religion of the nation. And let the old and the young, rich and the poor, brave and the gay, all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly on its altars. Yet, not even Lincoln holds out the most consistent example of these principles. 25 years after he gave his speech on the supremacy of law, Lincoln had to confront a rebellion whose principal temptation was to throw aside the restraints of law in the interest of simple national self-preservation. And it has to be admitted that this was a temptation to which Lincoln was not entirely immune. Lincoln is, after all, the president who suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the opening weeks of the Civil War, whose generals conducted arrests and created military tribunals to deal with outspoken dissidents, and who personally authorized the closure of at least 3 newspapers. Possibly the worst example Lincoln offers of reaching for the panic button on the civil liberties is the notorious case of Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham, whose denunciations of the Lincoln administration in May of 1863 convinced Union officers and officials that Vallandigham had crossed the line from free speech to treason by denouncing the war and the Lincoln administration as wicked, cruel, and unnecessary. Vallandigham was arrested in his home in the middle of the night by soldiers sent by the local military department commander. When a national outcry erupted, Lincoln allowed himself to lapse into purely pragmatic excuses for the arrest. He who dissuades one man from volunteering or induces one soldier to desert weakens the Union cause as much as he who kills a Union soldier in battle, Lincoln argued. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert? Well, the answer of emotion to that question is, no, you must not shoot the simple-minded soldier boy who deserts. Yes, you must touch the hair of the wily agitator. That's the emotional answer. The answer of the Constitution is, yes, you must shoot the deserter. And no, you may not touch a hair of the head of the wily agitator. So in defending the arrest and exile of Vallandigham, Lincoln nearly reasoned his way into precisely the setting aside of law that he had warned against in 1838. The Constitution, he claimed, is not, at least in the Vallandigham case, in its application in all respects the same in cases of rebellion or invasion involving the public safety as it is in times of profound peace and public security. This is an argument which the heat of national crisis seemed to justify. But this is also an argument which would justify setting aside the rule of law at any moment when authority could declare the moment to be an emergency of some sort. And ultimately, Lincoln's argument was an argument which would be thrown down by the Supreme Court in Ex parte Milligan once the war was over, declaring that the Constitution is the law of the land as much in times of peace as in times. But to admit that Lincoln was not always a spotless model of democracy is no more than what we must say about all failures to match practice with principle. Lincoln knew better, and he practiced better. And the deviations from law that his administration committed were deviations from the norm, rather than a rule for all cases. In 1861, he rebuked his longtime friend and political ally, Orville Hickman Browning, for suggesting that a military department commander should throw the laws of property and personal liberty to the winds whenever it seemed desirable. You speak of martial law as being the only means of saving the government, Lincoln replied angrily. On the contrary, it is itself the surrender of the government. Can it be pretended that it is any longer the government of the United States, any government of Constitution and laws, wherein a general or a president may make permanent rules of property by proclamation. And when his over-righteous Treasury Secretary, Salmon Portland Chase, urged him in September of 1863 to extend unilaterally the Emancipation Proclamation from its coverage of just the Confederate States to the 4 loyal states which still legalized slavery, Lincoln replied to Chase that he had no authority under law to do so. If I take the step, must I not do so without any argument, except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right? Would I not thus be giving up all footing upon Constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? Lying behind Lincoln's preoccupation with the rule of law in providing structure to democracy was his sense that law was an expression of a basic Enlightenment virtue, the centrality of reason. Lincoln was very much a man of reason and the Enlightenment, and like the great practitioners and theorists of Enlightenment politics, Locke, Montesquieu, Jefferson, he saw in law a force which demanded that people think clearly and logically about the consequences of their public actions and decisions. Law is about coherence, about rules that proceed from point to point like a geometric proof, and which match violations of public reason with punishments which deter future actions and rebalance the scales of justice. Law operates on the basis of reason, which makes it very, very different power. Without reason, law becomes the exercise of passion and impulse, both of them very nearly the worst words for political life in Lincoln's dictionary. Happy day, he said, when all appetites controlled, all passions subdued, all matters subjected, mind, all conquering mind, shall live and move the monarch of the world. Glorious consummation, said in February of 1842. Hail, fall of fury, reign of reason, all hail. It was their temptation to make themselves subject to passions, which he believed drove slave owners to justify the odious institution of slavery. By contrast, he said, it should be the mark of the opponents of slavery to do nothing through passion and ill temper. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln would characterize the Confederate secession as an act of passion, which reason must subdue. Passion may have strained, he said, but it must not break our bonds of affection. Lincoln pleaded with Americans not to allow themselves to be persuaded of the folly of civil war, and the thing which would do that would be the better angels. It is when passion gains the upper hand in a democracy that the sovereignty that the people possess is transformed into the mere ugliness of power. This is what Lincoln called the mobocratic spirit, a moment when the wild and furious passions usurp the sober judgments of courts. The unreasoning spirit of the mob is what leads to anarchy, and anarchy to the overthrow of democracy by despotic schemers like Alexander the Great or Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense, he said. And nothing more nearly captured the rule of reason and the rule of law. Allow these characteristics of sovereignty, of elections, of majorities, and of law. Allow those characteristics to prevail. And Lincoln believed that democracy will become the most direct means of allowing the natural rights that are hardwired into every human being their full sway. Now, it has to be said that these characteristics give no room for populists like Andrew Jackson, who imagine that they may act as the personal agent of some general personal will. Nothing agitated Lincoln more during his solitary term in the House of Representatives in 1847 to 1849 than the claim by Jackson's political heir, James Knox Polk, that, as Polk said, the people in framing our admirable system of government were conscious of the infirmities of their representatives, and so the people have commanded the president to execute their will. As president himself, Lincoln impressed observers very, very differently, as unpretending, faithful, loyal, as though it had never occurred to Mr. Lincoln that he was a ruler. Lincoln was also not an elitist. He had no glittering resume, teeming with perfect credentials. He belonged to no university alumni association. He had no noticeable executive experience. After all, he'd never even served as governor of Illinois. He'd never even been mayor of his hometown of Springfield. And in fact, he'd been defeated in 2 attempts to get elected to the U.S. Senate in 1855 and again in 1858. What he had, however, were the great personal qualities that those 4 characteristics of democracy thrive. First of those personal characteristics was resilience. Resilience. He was prepared to absorb a great deal of abuse and punishment without either retaliating or withdrawing into self-pity. When he was viciously criticized, he merely replied, "I have endured a great deal of ridicule without much malice, and have received a great deal of kindness, not quite free from ridicule. I am used to it." He also had the characteristic of humility, not the phony humility so evident in politicians who feign stooped postures toward public opinion while really soaking up personal affirmation. Lincoln did not need to write to Ulysses Grant on July 13, 1863, after the fall of Vicksburg, to congratulate Grant on his victory. Grant, after all, had been a Stephen Douglas Democrat, and for all Lincoln knew, Grant might emerge as a presidential challenger in the 1864 election. Nevertheless, Lincoln writes to Grant, and he candidly concedes that when you got below Vicksburg and took Fort Gibson, Grand Gulf, and vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks. And when you turned northward east of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. When was the last time we heard a president of the United States say that? He would have gone even further with another general, George McClellan, who was clearly a political critic. If that general could only have given him a reason. "I will hold McClellan's horse," Lincoln remarked. Slight measure. "I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only give us success." And then there was humor. Proper Proper political gentlemen in top hats and waistcoats deplored Lincoln's penchant at joke-telling, especially when some of it veered in impolite directions. But he also used humor to relieve stress and to level pretentiousness. Pretentiousness being the badge of would-be elitists. When the angry Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade came storming down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol all the way to the White House to tell Lincoln everything that he was doing wrong, Lincoln tried to interrupt him with a story. "You're letting the country go to hell on anecdotes," Wade roared back. "We are not more than a mile from there now." "Senator," Lincoln replied, "isn't that about the distance between here and the Capitol?" Wade said that he turned around, walked out of the office, down the steps, out onto the street, met someone he knew out on Pennsylvania Avenue, and said, "Well, Lincoln sold me that time." Indeed, he did. Lincoln had patience. He was disinclined to rush to conclusions. He had what they call among the French the coup d'œil, coup of the eye, capacity to see the direction of events and wait on them, beyond panic and contradiction. We may differ with him, have differed with him, Kentucky Governor Thomas Bramlett admitted after Lincoln's death. But when the judgment of future events has come, we find we were differing blindly, that he was right, we were wrong. Lincoln was even more disinclined to turn judgment into vengeance. "I shall do nothing in malice," he told the Louisiana Unionist Cuthbert Bullitt in 1862. "What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing." But with the imminent end of the Civil War before him, Lincoln declined, in his second inaugural address, to call for retribution. Instead, he asked for malice toward none, for charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see. These are qualities which are opposed to what we find in authoritarians and dictators. They lust for honor, self-righteousness, display, style, coercion. And it's also different from the qualities that we find in bureaucrats who pride themselves on efficiency, on technical competence, on correct procedure. Not Lincoln. To his contemporaries, Lincoln even looked like democracy. One shrewd Swiss visitor was met by Lincoln with the utmost kindness and cordiality, and took in the face of this rustic man, with its angular features, its immense brow, expressive of rare energy, its frank, open, intelligent, and mild look, its expression of honest loyalty and perfect rectitude. What can be finer than this union of simplicity, power? Democracies need these qualities in their leaders, because these are the oil to democracy's machinery: sovereignty, elections, majorities. If in these troubled times we want to know how to sustain democracy, Lincoln is indeed a good place to look for both the machinery and the characteristics that make it work, and not just for democracy's leaders, but for ourselves as well.
All right. Thank you, Allen. We have time for some questions, and we have a tradition in the Madison program of allowing students to ask the first questions and the rest of you later. So are there any students who happen to have any questions that they might like to ask Professor Guelzo? And you will be shy, as you often are.
I think you should begin with Ethan, the back row. Oh, you got to go on the spot.
No.
No.
No. Anyone? All right. Oh, we have one. Please, go ahead.
So in the book, you talk how on, I think maybe chapter 2, touch on passion and law and how Lincoln is so much in favor of law that he's not, he's not in favor of civil disobedience much. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, the concept of civil disobedience scarcely existed in Lincoln's. Putting the two words together would almost have been considered a contradiction in terms. The closest that anyone really comes to it in practical terms is Henry David Thoreau. And that is not a definition that it acquires a great deal in the way of popular acceptance. In Lincoln's mind, there is a binary. And the binary is either you are going to be ruled by law or you are going to be ruled by power. Now, if you are ruled by law, then you're being ruled into democracy, or at least you have some kind of say over the making of that law. If you are ruled by power, you have no say in it at all, because it is whoever has acquired that power who then tells you what you are going to do. And if you'd like to call that law in some kind of strange sense, yes, you can, but in fact, it is really only power, because there's no requirement of consistency on the part of people who exercise power. Someone who exercises power can say to you, Adam, I want you to do that. Now, someone else could then say to Jane, you do the exact opposite of that. Power will require you to obey and punish you if you do not, without any sense that there should be some consistency between the two. So for Lincoln, there really is only two categories that we can deal with practically. In the 19th century, an alternative to that really is not there on the ground. And to a certain degree, you can understand how urgent this was for Lincoln, because Lincoln makes that comment in 1838 about making law the political religion of the nation. He is dealing in a moment of one mob action after another, murderous mob actions. He was, in fact, referring specifically to the lynching of the abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, in nearby Alton, Illinois. To him, that was the premier example of what happens when you fail to obey law. That is the most radical example of the exercise of power. So he sets up the binary. And he does that because in the 19th century, that was the most common way of understanding the question.
Thank you. Other students? Yeah. He's good. You might speak into the mic. This is the microphone. Oh, because of the tape. Very good.
Thank you, Professor Guelzo, for the incredible talk. So you mentioned these 4 characteristics: resilience, humility, humor, and patience, as 4 characteristics of democratic leadership. Are these 4 characteristics, though, are these 4 characteristics that can easily translate into political success that is necessary to actually become a leader of a democracy?
Well, this is all clear. Lucas, is there something I need to do to this? Ah, there we are. A little light comes on. I'm a techno-incompetent. In the case of these characteristics, there is a great debate that divides what we might today call leadership studies. And that is leadership a matter of acquisition? Are there certain characteristics you can go out and say, I want to become like that, and develop them? Or are these sort of miraculously hardwired into some people, and the reason you study these characteristics is not because you're trying to foster or develop them in yourself, but so that you can recognize them in others? I don't have an easy answer to that dichotomy, and neither does anyone else, if I can judge by the number of books that are published on leadership. If the answer was straightforward, we'd only need 2 or 3. Instead, we've got lots of them, like, Leadership Lessons of Attila the Hun. Yeah, right. In such a case, what might I suggest? I would suggest that you can have an element that works in both. You may discover within yourself some of these characteristics. If so, very good. But there are others that you can work to emulate. As it was often said in Alcoholics Anonymous, if you can't make it, fake it. And what that really means is, if it's not coming automatically and easily, don't despair. Work at it. Work at it as a script, and it will become yours. Now, Samuel, I take it from your question you're planning to become President of the United States. So, you have some time. So, is it worth looking at Lincoln as an example? You may look within yourself and say, oh, I don't have much patience. Oh, no one has ever laughed at my jokes. All that may be true. But you may look to Lincoln as an example personally for the characteristics you do share, and who knows over time, you may find within you the springs of things you did not at this particular moment in your life see. Encourage their growth, and the surprise will be a blessing to you and to everyone around you.
Other students? Oh, graduate students count? That counts. Are you? Oh, okay. Yeah. Line them up. That's no objection.
Yeah, I retired from the military before I came here, so I'm the second oldest undergraduate. I'm competing for the first, so hopefully she graduates soon. Ms. Thomas, hey. So we talk about law and looking back at the past for guidance, and the Supreme Court, as you know, has come under a lot of scrutiny. And that's not different from Lincoln's time. He battles it out with Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney. There are some court challenges, such as the blockade, that had Taney ruled against it, and thankfully that didn't go that way.
But it was prize cases was a 5-4 decision.
Yes.
Jeff, can I interrupt just a moment? Just to illustrate, he's referring here to what's known as prize cases, which was a collection of 4 cases up to the Supreme Court about the legitimacy of the federal blockade. And the real question was, well, blockades are legal in international law only between independent sovereign countries. Lincoln has declared the Confederacy not to be an independent sovereign country. Ergo, is it legal to impose a blockade? And from that, you can imagine all the litigation that would flow. And the decision of the Supreme Court basically is one of these, let's have our cake and eat it. It is a decision which says, all right, we're not really, yes, in a war of 2 sovereign independent nations, but you can still put a blockade in place. That is a 5-4 decision. Change 1 vote on the Supreme Court, the entire apparatus of the federal blockade falls to the ground, and perhaps the war with it. So that's a long parenthesis, but yes, please continue.
Anaconda plan.
Right, I do footnotes.
So, so what does Lincoln do if the 1 vote shifts the other way? In this case, the story of respecting the law.
He doesn't tell us. What he has done is to make some strategic appointments to the court. He had the advantage coming into office that there were 2 deaths and 1 resignation on the Supreme Court. So he has a fairly wide hand at appointing people sympathetic to. He appoints his old judge from the 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois, David Davis, appoints him to the Supreme Court. He appoints people who he knows are going to be consistent with his view of things. And the result is that 5-4 decision. Chief Justice Taney, of course, was gnashing his teeth. He wrote the minority opinion in prize cases, but he was outvoted. But my goodness, by one vote. You think the Civil War is an affair which is decided by battles on battlefields. But in this case, the Civil War might have been decided by the turn of one vote in the United States Supreme Court. That's a sobering thing to take with you to sleep tonight. Yes, that'll keep you up for a while.
Wait. I stand. Thank you. So I also had a question about Lincoln and the court. So Lincoln often is known for making the argument that sometimes the executive and legislative branches can resist the court, that while you respect the sort of ruling in the individual controversy, you don't necessarily need to endorse the principles underlying the decision. I'm kind of curious how that's squared with his, as you articulated it, general urging to, one, sort of obey the law and cherish the law as part of sort of our democratic commitment. And maybe what does it say about Lincoln's conception of the role of courts and democracy in that relationship?
Well, Lincoln, of course, is a lawyer by profession, so he's involved in law and the courts. There are even some 90 cases on record in the old days as a lawyer in Springfield where he substituted as a judge. Never officially, formally a judge, but Judge Davis suffered from migraine, and when he did, he invited Lincoln to pinch hit for him as a judge. In terms of his philosophy as a Supreme Court jurisprudence, let's call it, for many years, Lincoln, in consonance with what he said in 1838, is very absolute on the authority of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court speaks, that's it, period. Until Dred Scott. And Dred Scott shifts the plates, the tectonic plates, from under him. And he clearly has a very difficult time working his way around the authority that he is supposed to understand and see in the court and the nature of the decision that Taney has handed down. To reduce it to the most immediate detail, he will say that what Dred Scott as a decision represents is not final. It does not represent a unanimous court. It is founded upon defective discovery, and therefore we may legitimately hope for the overturning or reversal of the decision or some aspects of the decision. In the meanwhile, he says, you cannot disobey the court. You cannot stage, for instance, violations of the fugitive slave law. And even in his run-up to the presidency, he will continue to insist the fugitive slave law is noxious. It is the law. It is on the books. It has to be obeyed. This disappointed many abolitionists in him. They looked at him and said, what kind of an anti-slavery man is this who will not oppose the fugitive slave law? But Lincoln's response was, it is the law of the land. Until it is reversed in Congress, until it is repealed, until it is overturned in some fashion or other, it is still the law of the land, and we cannot agitate or advocate for people to dismiss it or defy it. Now, sometimes in practical application, Lincoln was inclined to look in some other directions. There was one famous case, a murder case, in fact, about a woman who had, in self-defense, murdered her husband. She was put on trial, and at a recess in the trial, she and Lincoln were in one of the rooms in the courthouse, and she said, you know, I'm getting very thirsty. I'd like a glass of water. She said, I think there's, and he replied, I believe that there's very good water in Tennessee. He left the room. When the court came back into session, she had vanished. Yes, so Lincoln understood that law and justice do not always fit together like a perfect 1,000-piece puzzle. But his description of how to respond to that was one he pulls from the Gospels. He says, in the Gospels you find, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Not, he said, not that anyone believes that they are going to achieve that perfection, but that they should aspire to it energetically. And he said, we must do the same in our understanding of law. We are not perfect, but we aspire to it. And within the framework of the American democracy, we have great opportunity for realizing those aspirations. So there is a subtlety and a struggle in Lincoln's understanding of how the courts will function this way. And of course, the most dramatic example is his suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Chief Justice Taney and Ex parte Merriman will object and say he has no authority to do that. Congress alone has the authority to suspend the writ. Lincoln comes back and says, no, that's not what it says in the Constitution. In the Constitution, yes, the article about suspension of the writ is in the article concerning the affairs and powers of Congress. But it doesn't explicitly say. And on that silence, Lincoln hangs his defiance of Chief Justice Taney. But he does it, you see, by legal reasoning, not by simply an assertion of power. I am right, he is wrong, therefore I can ignore him. Even there, he has to reason his way, and wants others to reason their ways too.
Yes, sir. Sorry. Christy has to run halfway across them.
Howdy. I was curious with Lincoln's role with the military effort in terms of he often seemed somewhat to make decisions and sometimes was at odds with the generals that were in charge of the military. Was there a place he was getting his military opinions from, or was he coming up with his thoughts on how the war should be conducted independently? Or
it's a very good question as whether you could say he got his notion of military affairs from any place at all. He was, after all, for most of his political career, a Whig, and the Whigs prided themselves on being the non-military party of the Republic. Andrew Jackson was the military chieftain, and the Jacksonians were supposed to be guilty of that, and Lincoln only ever serves one brief spell in the Illinois militia in the early 1830s. After that, he makes fun of military preparedness, of generals, talks about militia gatherings that look like drunken parties, and he pokes fun at them. And then he has to become commander-in-chief in the middle of a war. Well, he sets to it in pretty much the same way he set to making himself a lawyer. He went and borrowed books on military science from the Library of Congress. Well, I'm sorry to say that that is really not the best way to learn about war. And I have to say that it showed in his management of a lot of military affairs and military people. I do not want to persuade anyone here that Lincoln walked on the Potomac. And managing military affairs was not his long suit. Strategically speaking, he was still stuck back in Napoleonic days. And it really wasn't until he found a general whom he could trust politically, which was Ulysses Grant, that he finally agrees to let go and allow Grant to take charge of things, which Grant, of course, does and brings matters to a successful conclusion. But Lincoln once made the comment that up until the time he put Grant in charge, he stayed up all night worrying about military affairs. But now that Grant is in command, he can finally get a good night's sleep. But he was not on the whole what you might call a military adept. It simply was not within his frame of reference. And there's a good deal that can be said about the way the war is conducted, that his inexperience in that department unfortunately shows. complicated by the fact that so much of the upper echelons of the U.S. military were politically arrayed against him. There were not many abolitionists in the upper command levels of the United States Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Many, many more of them were actually very sympathetic to the opposition party and were not shy about articulating that opposition and criticizing Lincoln. I'd mentioned George McClellan. He had some very colorful descriptive vocabulary about Lincoln. He called him the original guerrilla, an ape. And he put this in letters that he wrote to people as well. This wasn't something he kept in a closet. So you might say that much of the military itself did not go out of its way to bring him into a place of military enlightenment. They regarded him as more of a problem. And sometimes the generals would sway their soldiers to have that same thought. He eventually dismisses George McClellan in November of 1862. When he does, McClellan reviews the Army of the Potomac for the last time, and when that happens, soldiers in the Irish Brigade threw down the brigade colors in front of McClellan's horse, crying, "Lead us to Washington, General, we'll follow you." Coup d'etat. So there was a tension there. It is only as we move through the war that the opinion of the soldiers begins to change about Lincoln, so that finally in the 1864 election, the majority of the soldier vote will in fact go to Lincoln rather than McClellan. There's a wonderful drawing that Alfred Woad made of Lincoln reviewing troops. He got it down off his horse and went over and began shaking hands with men standing in line for the review. And Woad caught this one moment, a sergeant at the end of a file, looking in surprise at Lincoln, and the motto was, "You gonna shake with me, Abe?" And the answer, of course, was yes. Yes. But yes, there's a very complicated story to be told about Lincoln and the military.
Yes, sir. Right here in the green. Yeah.
Thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Help me understand, or help us understand, your decision for the title of your book, Our Ancient Faith, because I have not finished it or just purchased it very, very recently. But the point being that I'm interested in how you came to that position about our ancient faith. Thank you.
The phrase comes from the speech he gave on October 16th, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, which in a lot of ways is a speech which reintroduces Lincoln to the public political platform. He'd been in politics most of his life. He'd been elected to Congress, but after the election to Congress, the reaction was so disappointing that he came back to Illinois, went back to practicing law, and pretty much gave up all hope of any political future. It is only when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is adopted by Congress at the prompting of Stephen A. Douglas that this is an earthquake event for Lincoln and brings him back into political activism. And the great Peoria speech is the opening gun of a political rebirth which will take him all the way to the White House. In the Peoria speech, which I do not hesitate to say to people, that if everything else Lincoln wrote was somehow erased in a great electromagnetic pulse, if that speech alone survived, you would have all of Lincoln's political philosophy. In that speech, he talks about consent. He talks about the foundational nature of consent, how slavery is a violation of consent, how the permission we give to slavery to expand into the Western territories has disheartened the friends of freedom everywhere around the world. And then he speaks about how dedicated we must be to the ideas of the Declaration, to that sheet anchor of republicanism called consent. And he says first, this is my ancient faith. And then a paragraph later, he says, this is our ancient faith, so that one's commitment to democracy is to be understood as being almost of the same species as a religious fervor, that the kind of commitment that one would make to the divine, that intensity, that comprehensiveness, that is the commitment that we should make to democratic government. That, he said, that is what represents not just our ancient belief or our ancient convictions or our ancient documents. That is our ancient faith. It goes that deep into the marrow of our bones. And that was why I thought it was an apt phrase to use in a title in a book about Lincoln and democracy and where this American experiment was likely to go. So it is from the Peoria speech, and a speech that even today repays richly the careful reading. A great speech.
All air. Thank you, Dr. Guelzo. David, at some point we'll talk about Lincoln and the Supreme Court. I found some cool stuff on that in a research project. I'm curious, on the four characteristics you talked about for democratic leadership that Lincoln portrayed, the resilience, humility, humor, and patience. We talked a little bit about how him coming from the frontier helped shape those four characteristics in him, his legal practice, obviously, when it comes to law. But could you talk a little bit about how other factors from his personal life, whether it was the Calvinist influence on his outlook in life or his Whig operative days, how that may have influenced these four characteristics in him when he was president?
How long do we have, Shiloh?
15. Well,
let me at least say this. Lincoln is famous for being the president born in a log cabin, who comes up, from the hard scrabble ways of the frontier, and we assume, therefore, is shaped by it. Lincoln might not be too eager to agree with that. Lincoln didn't, of course, have any choice where he was born, but he might have wished he had. He never got along at all terribly well with his father. His father was a kind of go-day, come-day, God-send-Sunday farmer. Not troubled by anything in particular, and not really very, very diligent. And above all, a farmer who was content to be a farmer. Young Abraham could have cared less about farming. He wanted to read books. Books after books after. He wanted an education. His father spurned that. He said, What do you want to get an education for? His father, he said afterwards, his father could only bunglingly sign his own name. And in many ways, Lincoln did almost everything he could to get away from the life of the frontier. He found the life of the frontier to be crude, to be heavily laced with alcohol, with sex, with all kinds of irregularity of behavior. He said that the most prevalent song in his days growing up in southern Indiana was a variation on the national air. Hail Columbia, happy land. He said, in Indiana they sang it this way: Hail Columbia, happy land, if you ain't drunk, I will be damned. That was not an appreciative or admiring comment. Lincoln did not like to advertise to people what his upbringing had been like. When someone in Springfield pressed him on it, he held the questioner at arm's length, and when the questioner persisted, he only replied, I have seen a great deal of the backsides of the world. He wouldn't go beyond that. In 1858, in July of 1858, was he's in the beginning of these great debates with Stephen A. Douglas. One of the editors of the Chicago Tribune wrote to him, because the Tribune was sympathetic to Lincoln, and the editor, Charles Ray, wrote to him and said, I have a suspicion that Abraham Lincoln was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Well, all right, Ray was correct. What was interesting about the question was that someone had to ask that, because no one knew a whole lot about Lincoln's past. He was not eager to talk about it. When he was sent a form by Charles Landman, who was the editor of the first biographical dictionary of Congress, he filled out the form. He had, name, when, time, date of birth, where you live, what your profession is. There was a line there for education. Lincoln answered that line with one word: defective. That is not a word of overwhelming confidence about his experience that way. There are no alumni of defective university. So Thomas, my basic reaction is it's difficult to know what you could say shaped Lincoln on the frontier, although there are many things that, in a sense, shape him in a negative way. This is a man who sees all this pervasive drunkenness around him. He's a teetotaler. He says he won't drink because it makes him feel flabby and undone. More than that, I think because it made him feel like he had somehow identified himself with the worst kinds of behavior that he had seen growing up. So, yes, perhaps the shaping influences from the frontier are the negative ones for Lincoln, what to avoid. And sometimes we forget that is also an important aspect of the creation of character.
I'm going to ask you a question with the moderator's privilege, if you don't mind, following up.
That is your privilege.
Yeah.
Moderator's privilege.
So I like the question very much, and your answer also. And I can't help but notice you have this trait here, humility.
Yes.
But Lincoln was not so humble as not to think that he didn't deserve to be president of the United States. I mean, that takes a certain,
certain degree of self-confidence.
Yeah. And I have in mind also the Lyceum speech, where he seems to remark in some depth on the character of the ambition of great men. And so I ask you this question: what was the source, in your view, of Lincoln's ambition? In other words, why was he ambitious? What did he want, and what did he think he was going to get by becoming president of the United States?
He believed he was going to stop something. He did not see himself as the carrier of a crusade to do something so much as it was to prevent something from happening. In this case, to prevent the legalization of slavery in the Western territories. He insisted right in his first inaugural address that he had no plan, no inclination, no desire, directly or indirectly, to meddle with slavery in the states where it was legal. All that he was going to do was to make it clear that there would be no legalization beyond that. There was going to be a sort of Berlin Wall built around the places where slavery was then legal. So he does not come with a great campaign that he's going to put in place. It is, if anything, it is a negative campaign to prevent something from happening. And yet it does have to be said that when we talk about humility, we're not really talking about Uriah Heep. What we're really talking about is seeing yourself for who you are and what you are, seeing yourself in the place of things. And if gifts or talents and situations afford you the opportunity, the exercise of those things, it is not a contradiction of humility to aspire to them, to reach for them, to occupy them. If anything, it would be a false version of humility to pull back and to hesitate. John Hay once had something of the same question that you've asked. It was put to Hay, was Lincoln a humble man? And Hay's response was, no great man is ever really humble. This is the same John Hay, though, who makes this comment in September of 1863. He's writing to his fellow staffer, John Nicolay. And he says to Nicolay, I never understood till now what complete control the tycoon, that was his offhand term for Lincoln, the tycoon. I never understood till now how thoroughly the tycoon has in control conscription, the cabinet, Congress, conduct of the war. He sits there, Hay said, like some backwoods Jupiter, throwing his thunderbolts. But then Hay added, there is none so good and kind as he. I believe that God has put him in this place. So when we speak of humility, which is almost the contradiction of anyone in politics, when you speak of humility, understand that we must not confine ourselves to stereotypes of what we think humility is. Humility is a right understanding of yourself, a reception of what is rightly due, and the giving to others what is rightly due them. And when we understand that, then we could put our finger, I think, on the article that we can call genuine political humility. And it strikes me that if there is anyone who embodies that in the history of the American presidency, and I think Abraham Lincoln captures a great deal of that. But I speak only personally and, of course, not from intimate knowledge of Abraham Lincoln, because I am not, to the shock and amazement of my students, not quite that old.
Please, sir. Yep.
Aside the current presidential aspirants, how would you rate and talk about recent presidents and how they have behaved in comparison to what you've said about Lincoln?
I don't know. I don't read books about recent presidents. I have enough trouble trying to keep up with the Lincoln literature. But I do understand what you're asking, and in truth, questions similar to that are asked of me everywhere that I go. A lot of them do, in fact, come down very explicitly to saying, well, would Lincoln do this or would Lincoln do the other? To which at that point, I have to exercise a certain epistemological humility and say that I don't know. I was interviewed several months ago by a national magazine, and the interviewer I knew from previous articles and whatnot that we had collaborated on. And after an hour's worth of questioning about the book and so on like that, then she turned and asked this question, which I was astonished by. Would Lincoln have voted for, and I'll just say fill in the blank? And my response was, I haven't the faintest idea. That's not history, that's prophecy. That would be like asking if Lincoln would take an Uber. Lincoln would most likely ask, what's an Uber? So the historian can only speak to those things that history permits the historian to speak upon, and projections otherwise, that leads you out of any place where you can speak with any degree of clarity and authority. So there's a certain hesitation I have. I think that you can ask the question, for instance, in more general terms, what might have happened if Lincoln had lived? People sometimes do ask me, if you could go back in time, where would you go? And I say, no question, no problem. I would go to Ford's Theater, 14th of April, 1865, and I would lock John Wilkes Booth in the men's room. Mind you, they didn't have a men's room then, but you know what I mean. I can say that there are things, I can make projections and assumptions. Had Lincoln lived to finish out his second term, might this have been different? Might that have been different? Might Reconstruction have been much more a successful affair than it actually became? And the answer I can give you projections to, but they're not more than projections. They are guesses. And ultimately, one has to say, I do not know. And in that case, I don't. So what would Lincoln say in response to some particular situations or individuals today? I don't know, but I'm not really sure he would call for an Uber. Does that help? No, I didn't think it would. It doesn't help. I have to say, it doesn't help me either.
We have just a young woman in the back here. Putting you to work here, Christy. Sorry.
Hello, Professor Guelzo. Thank you so much for your talk today. I attended the James Madison Program event last year with the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation that you helped moderate, and with the qualities on the board up there. I know that humility was one of Calvin Coolidge's strongest qualities, and I was wondering what comparisons you could draw between Abraham Lincoln and Calvin Coolidge, and just have like maybe contrast as well. Just interesting.
Lincoln talked more.
Yeah.
That's certainly one thing. Lincoln is a much more eloquent person. And Coolidge has one genuinely remarkable speech. There's one he gives on the Declaration of Independence for the 150th anniversary of independence. But he's not otherwise remarked upon as being a particularly eloquent president. Lincoln is. Lincoln has a way with words. He has read a great deal. He has a remarkably retentive memory for what he has read. He can read things and then years later, just repeat them off by heart. Big chunks of Shakespeare, they came easily to him. He loved Shakespeare. So Lincoln has a facility with words, which is also sharpened by his 25 years as a lawyer, where the goal, of course, of his oratory is always persuasion. So when you hear Lincoln speak politically and when you hear him speak as president, the note you always are struck by is the note of persuasion. He wants to persuade you of something. He wants to lay out an argument and the evidence for it. He wants to get you to go along and say yes. He's not just content to present the situation. He is always the master of persuasion. And in that respect, Lincoln stands apart from so many people in political life. And I take the step beyond that to say also of presidents. And this is what I think is a major factor in how we constantly circle back to Lincoln. Because it is not just that Lincoln's ideas are worth remembering and emulating. There is also, and perhaps I should make this a fifth characteristic, there is a gift of words, a gift of being able to say things in such a way that it brings people along, that you can say it in a way that John Gardner once said, that you prick them so that they bleed. And he had that gift. There was a certain theatrical aspect to it. Lincoln loved theater. He's assassinated in a theater. He loved theater. He loved the telling of stories. I think he might have made an interesting actor. The people often, and he also was very good at imitating accents. He could recite Robert Burns with a Scotch brogue to the amazement of people. But there is a certain theatrical power to what Lincoln says, and when that power is on full display, it is well nigh irresistible. How else do you respond to someone who is saying that when you speak of slavery, you are speaking about something that is nothing less than the tyranny of monarchy, whether it comes from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. You feel the build-up, the rhythm in those words, until by that conclusion it is the same tyrannical principle. You are simply bowled over by it. And then, of course, there were the stories at just the right moment that illustrated things. Stephen Douglas found this out when he was conducting those great debates in 1858. He once said about Lincoln that he didn't fear Lincoln's reasoning, but every one of those stories was like a whack on his back. See, Lincoln could do that. He could distill political logic and moral fervency into words that would bring people with him. It was a great gift. It was a great gift.
It is, unfortunately, 6 o'clock, which means we are out of time. I do want to remind you that Professor Guelzo's book is on sale right outside the door. And please join me in thanking him for a wonderful lecture.